Welcome to this daily PBJ devotional. Read Deuteronomy 8, Isaiah 36, and Psalm 149 to keep going with the Old Testament reading schedule for the year. This devotional is about Deuteronomy 8. You must carefully follow every commandment I am giving you today, so that you may live and multiply and enter and possess the land that the Lord swore to give your fathers. Remember that these 40 years the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness, so that he might humble you and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commandments. He humbled you, and in your hunger he gave you manna to eat, which neither you nor your fathers had known, so that you might understand that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Your clothing did not wear out, and your feet did not swell during these 40 years. So know in your heart that just as a man disciplines his son, so the Lord your God disciplines you. Therefore you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and fearing him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of brooks and fountains and springs that flow through the valleys and hills, a land of wheat, barley, vines, fig trees, and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey, a land where you will eat food without scarcity, where you will lack nothing, a land whose rocks are iron and whose hills are ready to be mined for copper. When you eat and are satisfied, you are to bless the Lord your God for the good land that he has given you. Be careful not to forget the Lord your God by failing to keep his commandments and ordinances and statutes, which I am giving you this day. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses in which to dwell, and when your herds and flocks grow large, and your silver and gold increase, and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. He led you through the vast and terrifying wilderness with its venomous snakes and scorpions, a thirsty and waterless land. He brought you water from the rock of flint. He fed you in the wilderness with manna that your fathers had not known, in order to humble you and test you, so that in the end he might cause you to prosper. You might say in your heart, "The power and strength of my hands have made this wealth for me." But remember that it is the Lord your God who gives you the power to gain wealth, in order to confirm his covenant that he swore to your fathers even to this day. If you ever forget the Lord your God and go after other gods to worship and bow down to them, I testify against you today that you will surely perish. Like the nations that the Lord has destroyed before you, so you will perish if you do not obey the Lord your God. This is God's word. I've heard people who are encountering difficult times in their lives refer to that difficult period of time as wandering in the wilderness. That phrase is a metaphor drawn from Israel's 40 years of literally wandering in the wilderness before entering the promised land. Moses talked about that here in Deuteronomy 8. In verses 2 and 3, he described the reasons for that wilderness wandering. Those reasons were, 1, to humble the Israelites, according to verse 2b, 2, to test the Israelites in order to reveal whether or not they would keep God's commands from the heart. That's according to verse 2c. 3, to teach the Israelites to rely on God, according to verse 3d. If we think of times in our lives as wilderness wanderings, do we think about these purposes? Many times when we suffer, we think that our suffering has no purpose, or we just have a vague sense that our faith is being tested. These verses would challenge us to think more deeply about these problems in our lives. While this passage was not given to say that every problem or trial in life is like this, God's ways do follow similar patterns. So it is appropriate when we are suffering to think about God's reasons for bringing suffering into our lives, along the lines described in verses 2 and 3. That is, to humble us, to test us, and to teach us. Let's focus on that third one, to teach us. Verse 3d tells us that God wanted to teach a very specific lesson, which was that man does not live by bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. This phrase relates to God's miraculous gift of manna, as verse 3b says. And the point of this lesson was that God would provide for his people if they trusted him and obeyed his word, even if they didn't know how he would provide for them. I am sure it is hard to trust God when you have a credible fear of starving. With no food or access to the usual sources of food, a person may be tempted to curse God, to jettison faith, or to conclude that God does not exist. God and Moses wanted people to know that they needed to trust God to stay alive more than they needed everyday sources of food. Israel wandered and suffered in the desert. Jesus also suffered in the desert. His suffering lasted 40 days rather than 40 years. But he countered Satan's first temptation by quoting this passage, Deuteronomy 8, verse 3. He knew well that it was more important to trust God the Father than it was to provide for his daily needs by any means necessary. When he refused to sin by turning stones into bread, he was depending on the promise that God the Father would provide for him if he trusted and obeyed God's word. Have you experienced a trial in your life that taught you to trust God and the promises of his word? If so, then you've seen him provide for you. Not the miracle provision of manna, but in some way showing himself faithful, providing that way after you obeyed his word. When we are tempted to sin, we need this message, just as Jesus used this message when he was tempted to sin. Giving in to temptation might meet a need, relieve a problem, or satisfy a desire, but it is the opposite of trusting God. If you face temptation today, remember this: God has allowed this into your life to teach you to trust him. If you will trust him, he will provide for you, just as he provided manna for Israel and angels to meet Jesus' needs. If you found this devotional helpful, please go to my website at dailypbj.com/subscribe and subscribe for free to receive these in your email every day. Please also consider supporting me financially and becoming part of my community by supporting me. Go to dailypbj.com/support for information about that. Please share this with someone who may be struggling in their faith today, and I'll see you next time. May God bless you. Hope you have a great day.